This is Politics UK. I'm Charlotte Wright. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. On the programme this week, as the conflict in Gaza and Israel continues into a third week, the Prime Minister briefs Parliament on the explosion at Al Ahli Hospital.
On the basis of the deep knowledge and analysis of our intelligence and weapons experts, the British government judges that the explosion was likely caused by a missile, or part of one, that was launched from within Gaza towards Israel.
After Storm Babette causes widespread flooding, there are questions about the effectiveness of precautions.
I'd like to ask the Minister why residents on Tapton Terrace only received a phone call from the early warning system after their houses had already been flooded.
I've fed into the Environment Agency. I know they're working very closely with people up there to fully review what happened.
The government moves some migrants out of hotels and onto the Bibby Stockholm barge moored off Portland.
We will continue to deliver on our strategy to stop the boats.
They've sent more Home Secretaries to Rwanda than asylum seekers.
999.
And the Welsh Ambulance Service declares an extraordinary incident. Will there be long waits for ambulances this winter? Well, the conflict in Israel and Gaza continued to dominate the headlines this week. Susan, the Prime Minister briefed MPs on his meetings with Middle Eastern leaders, and he also shared some intelligence reports about that hospital explosion. What did he say to MPs?
Yes, indeed. So this was Rishi Sunak reporting back to the Commons after his trip to the Middle East. He'd made a statement the week before on the conflict, and I did notice a bit of a difference in the questions MPs were asking after another week of looking at those pictures of Palestinians and the suffering of Palestinians. There were lots of calls for some kind of a humanitarian pause to let aid in food and water and indeed fuel. As you say, though, the Prime Minister also had something to say about that blast at the Al Ahli Hospital in Gaza. Hamas had originally said that it was caused by an Israeli missile. However, the Prime Minister said British analysis showed something rather different. Let's have a listen.
On the basis of the deep knowledge and analysis of our intelligence and weapons experts, the British government judges that the explosion was likely caused by a missile, or part of one, that was launched from within Gaza towards Israel. The misreporting of this incident had a negative effect in the region, including on a vital US diplomatic effort and on tensions here at home. We need to learn the lessons and ensure that in future there is no rush to judgment.
For too long we've talked about a two-state solution, the dignity and justice of a Palestinian state, alongside a safe and secure Israel, without a serious path or will to make it happen. And for too long we have allowed welcome progress in improving relations between Israel and her neighbours to sit without any progress on the future for Palestine and its people. That must change.
On our collective, unequivocal condemnation of the abhorrent attacks of the 7th of October, this House has been and continues to be fully united. However, in respect of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and whilst I do welcome the announcements from the Prime Minister today, I believe that we can and must go further.
Hamas's evil attacks have claimed far too many innocent lives already. Israel unquestionably has the right to protect its citizens and target these brutal terrorists in line with international law. So does the Prime Minister agree with many of us, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, that the UK should be leading diplomatic efforts to secure a pause in hostilities with a temporary humanitarian ceasefire to allow for the hostages to be released and to get aid into Gaza?
Prime Minister.
I'd just say to my honourable friend exactly what I have been trying to do over the past week, ensure that we can diplomatically engage with partners in the region, as indeed has the Foreign Secretary been doing, which has resulted in humanitarian aid coming into Gaza.
My right honourable friend knows that we must operate within the law. The law is clear, and it requires a ceasefire now in order to be implemented.
The killings on October the 7th were appalling, and they have to be totally condemned, as everyone has done today. The loss, however, of 5,000 Palestinian lives in Gaza is continuing and getting worse. The question is, why did the Prime Minister instruct Britain's representative of the UN not to support the call for a very minimal thing, which is a humanitarian pause to allow aid to go in and a ceasefire to take place to start to bring about a process of peace?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, our regional and diplomatic engagement has extensively been focused about how we can bring about a better and brighter future for the people of Palestine and the Palestinians. But I would say to the honourable gentleman, I'm surprised he hasn't made any reference to the fact that an organisation that he once described as a friend has perpetrated an absolutely appalling act of terrorism on over 1,000 people.
So that was MPs discussing the conflict in Israel and Gaza this week. But despite it being the biggest news story of the week, it didn't really dominate at Prime Minister's questions, did it?
No, well, ordinary MPs did raise it, as did the SNP, calling again for some kind of a humanitarian pause and maybe getting a bit of a shift from the Prime Minister on that. But you're right, Keir Starmer didn't concentrate on it, didn't ask about it. And perhaps no wonder he has got tensions in his own party about his stance on the conflict. So he concentrated on something that Labour can certainly all unite around, and that is those two big by-election wins the week before. They were both, the victors were sitting behind him. Quick reminder, one of the constituencies, Mid-Bedfordshire, used to be held by Nadine Dorries. Not a big fan of Rishi Sunak. She was an ally of Boris Johnson and never really forgave him for toppling Boris Johnson. And Keir Starmer also referred a lot in his questions to Tamworth, where the defeated Tory candidate had got a lot of flack for a Facebook post he'd made a few years ago, questioning whether people who had phone contracts and TV contracts really needed help with feeding their families. But he put it a bit more rightly than I have.
Can I start by welcoming the new member for Mid-Bedfordshire? The first Labour MP ever to represent those beautiful towns and villages. Can I also welcome the new member for Tamworth? She will be a powerful representative for her constituents. Is the Prime Minister as relieved as I am that those constituents are not burdened with his defeated candidate who told them, don't worry, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to sanitise this, to F off if they're struggling with the cost of living?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of what this government is doing to support the most vulnerable over the past year. But, Mr. Speaker, can I in fact join him in welcoming the new members to their places? After all, I suspect the new member for Mid-Beds may actually support me a little bit more than the last one. Although I did notice that the new member said that they will be opposing new housing in their local area, while the new member for Tamworth claimed that they will protect green spaces. I would urge them to have a word with their leader, because that's not exactly his position, Mr. Speaker. Although, with his track record of U-turns, who knows what his housing policy will be next week?
I do have to ask him, where on earth does the Prime Minister think his candidate got the idea in the first place that throwing expletives at struggling families was his government's official position?
Let's just look at the record of what this government is doing to help those people. Paying for around half of a typical family's energy bill over the last year, support worth over £1,500. For the most vulnerable in our society, receiving £900 in direct cost of living support, record increases in the national living wage, record increases in welfare, and this winter, Mr. Speaker, pensioners to receive an extra £200 or £300 alongside their winter fuel payment to help them through what we know is a tough time. All of that, Mr. Speaker, significant support funded by this government, all of that would be put at risk by Labour's reckless plans to borrow £28 billion a year.
He keeps boasting about how great things are. The voters keep telling him he's got it wrong. But I can see why the Tamworth candidate thought he was just following government lines. Annalisa and her 2 children lived in their home for 8 years. In May, they were kicked out with a no-fault eviction notice. Despite his government's pledge to scrap no-fault evictions, this week the Prime Minister crumbled to the landlords on his own backbenches and killed the policy. What message, other than the message delivered by his candidate in Tamworth, could Annalisa possibly take from that?
Mr. Speaker, we've taken significant action to help renters like Annalise and others. We've capped holding deposits at 1 week. We've protected tenants from rip-off tenancy fees, delivered almost 500,000 affordable homes for rent, and halved the number of percentage of substandard homes in the private rented sector, and strengthened local authority enforcement powers, because this government is delivering for renters. But we are also, Mr. Speaker, trying to ensure the new generation can buy their own home. So perhaps he can explain to Annalisa and thousands of millions of others why, when we brought forward plans to unlock 100,000 new homes, he stood in the way of that.
Across our country, the British people are rolling up their sleeves and getting on with it, doing their best in the face of a punishing cost of living crisis and a government that has abandoned them, abandoned renters at risk of being kicked out, abandoned mortgage payers struggling to make ends meet, abandoned those who dream of owning their own house. The truth is, his candidate in Tamworth summed up perfectly just how his and his Tories are treating the British public. So will he just call a general election and give the British public the chance to respond, as they did in Selby, Mid-Beds and Tamworth? They've heard the government telling them to F off, and they want the chance to return the compliment.
As we saw with his recent decisions on actually building new houses, politicians like him always take the easy way out, Mr. Speaker, whereas we're getting on making the right long-term decisions to change this country for the better on net zero, on HS2, on a smoke-free generation, on education and energy security. Contrast that to his leadership. Too cautious to say anything and hope that nobody notices, Mr. Speaker. Let me tell him, come that general election, the British people will.
Yesterday, the UN warned that hospitals in Gaza had just 48 hours of fuel left to keep their electricity going. That was 28 hours ago. The electricity runs out tonight. Now, we have a human responsibility to all the people in Gaza, but we have a particular responsibility for UK citizens, some of whom are in those hospitals with no food, no water, no medicine and no way out. So I want to ask the Prime Minister, how much worse does the situation have to get before he will join us in calls for a humanitarian ceasefire?
Mr. Speaker, from the start, we have said that the first and most important principle is that Israel has the right to defend itself under international law. Our support for that position is absolute and unchanged. But from the start, we have also said that we do want British nationals to be able to leave Gaza, and that we want hostages to be released and for humanitarian aid to get in. And we recognise that for all of that to happen, there has to be a safer environment, which of course necessitates specific pauses as distinct from a ceasefire. And we discussed this with partners yesterday evening at the United Nations. And we have also been consistently clear that everything must be done to protect civilians in line with international law and continue getting more aid flowing into Gaza.
All right, Susan, thanks very much for talking us through Prime Minister's questions there. We'll come back to you a little later, but let's go to Edinburgh now and our Scotland political reporter, Jenny Davidson, who's at the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. Jenny, the Scottish Parliament has been discussing the conflict in Israel and Gaza this week too. The First Minister, Humza Yousaf, has family in Gaza. What did he have to say about their situation?
Well, that's right. This is very close to home for the First Minister, Humza Yousaf. His wife's parents are trapped in Gaza, as is his wife's brother and family. And he's talked very emotionally over the last couple of weeks about this situation, about the daily phone calls with his mother-in-law, about losing sleep, worrying whether the family's going to make it through the night, and at one point mentioning that they were running low on water, only 6 bottles of water between about 100 people in their household. And in a statement on Israel and Gaza on Tuesday, amid all the politics of the situation, he also thanked opposition leaders and others in the Parliament for the personal messages of support to him and his family. And he talked again about that emotional toll the situation is taking on his family.
Every night, Nadia and I go to bed barely sleeping as we count down the hours until the morning, waiting anxiously for a message from my mother-in-law to tell us that they have survived the night. Throughout the day, the 100 people who are in our family home, well, they must ration their food. The adults barely eat. My mother-in-law, she only ate cashew nuts yesterday. They ration so the children in the house don't end up malnourished. But time is running out. And in the meantime, I have a wife who really wants to hug her mum and dad. I have 2 girls who really miss their granny and their granddad. And they just want to know, like many other families across the country, when they'll come home.
My party stands with Israel. We send them our love, our thoughts, and our sympathies. We also stand with the innocent people in Palestine caught up in this, including the First Minister's own family. We can see the toll it has taken on him, his wife Nadia, and their entire family. And we pray for a positive outcome for them.
Hamas is not Palestine. There is no justification for the collective punishment of the people of Gaza. So let me be clear, withholding water, electricity, food and medicine is a breach of international law. It may feel so far away, but I still believe in the cause of peace. And that's why there must be the immediate release of hostages.
And while this is very personal for Humza Yousaf and he has that link to Gaza, he's also been very careful to recognise the losses in Israel and also to reach out to the Jewish community here in Scotland. And that's something there's been concern about across parties, that communities here in Scotland should feel safe and this doesn't lead to a rise in either anti-Semitism or Islamophobia.
Jenny, North East Scotland was particularly badly hit by recent storms. What's been said about that?
Well, indeed, the North East particularly badly affected, road closures, people having to be evacuated from their homes. And one place in particular was the town of Brechin in Angus, where the River Esk breached its flood defences, and they were hit with more than a month's worth of rainfall in one weekend. Now, people there very badly affected. The First Minister was there on Monday to express his support for the people of Brechin, but particular concern about these flood defences because 16 million was spent on new flood defences for the town. It just finished in 2016, and they were supposed to provide 1 in 200 year event protection. So already they've been breached, these brand new flood defences, and there's been a lot of concern raised about that.
We are facing a climate crisis, and although no single storm event can be solely attributed to climate change, events like Storm Babette are becoming more frequent, more intense and more destructive due to the changing climate. Storm Babette reinforces the need to think strategically about Scotland's future and what we need to do to adapt to our changing climate.
From River Street in Brechin to the North Esk Caravan Park in St Cyrus, scores of people are homeless, with little prospect of return in the coming months. Like so many others across the North East, my own home in the Mearns has been badly damaged by the severity of the storm. Families are living in Airbnbs and on the goodwill of others. The flood defence scheme in Angus that cost £16 million in 2016 was all but swept away in a matter of hours. Infrastructure needs to be repaired and significant changes made in the vicinity of South Esk. There are massive issues with coastal erosion and flood damage to farms in Montrose.
lessons must be urgently learned. The Brecon scheme was only built 7 years ago and was designed to deal with a 1 in 200 years incident. So we urgently need to understand why it did fail to protect the communities it was designed to serve. That's critical in terms of new infrastructure being planned.
Now, Angela Constance said that a new flood resilience strategy will look ahead to 2045, but she also warned that the events in Brecon show that the Scottish Government will not be able to provide flood defences for all communities 100% of the time going forward.
And meanwhile, Jenny, at First Minister's Questions, Humza Yousaf was asked about Scottish Government messages being handed over to the UK COVID inquiry. What was the Scottish Conservative leader driving at there?
Well, indeed, this was comments made actually shortly before First Minister's Questions on Thursday by a legal counsel to the inquiry, Jamie Dawson KC. He said that evidence to the inquiry from people within Scottish Government suggested that informal messaging such as WhatsApp had been used to discuss the pandemic, things like advice or what action the Scottish Government might need to be taken. But he said that with one exception, the UK COVID inquiry had not had these kind of informal messages such as WhatsApp messages from the Scottish Government up to this point. And that's something that Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross asked questions on at First Minister's Questions.
In May this year, asked a direct question by a journalist, Humza Yousaf said if a request for messages, including WhatsApp, was made, the Scottish Government should be absolutely open and transparent. In June, he said in this chamber, and I quote, WhatsApp messages, emails, signal messages, telegram messages, or whatever will absolutely be handed over to the COVID inquiries and handed over to them in full. The inquiry has heard this morning that that has not happened. So where are the messages? Where have they gone? And has the Scottish Government deleted any messages?
If there is relevant information that has been passed on, I note the concerns that were raised this morning. Therefore, I've asked the Solicitor General just this morning to internally investigate whether there, of course, are any other messages that have to be handed over. So messages have been, whether it's WhatsApp, whether it's email, whether it's correspondence, all that information has been provided. I myself have provided a statement, of course, to the inquiry as well. But I do note the concerns that have been raised and can give an absolute assurance to the families listening, particularly those families that have been bereaved by COVID, where we hold any relevant information that will be passed on.
Now, the First Minister made quite a pointed comment that unlike the UK Government, the Scottish Government had not routinely made decisions about COVID over WhatsApp. But he did say that they take the comments by Council seriously and they would investigate.
All right, Jenny Davidson at Holyrood. Thanks very much for the update, Jenny. Susan, we heard from Jenny there talking about the flooding in Scotland this week, but it affected parts of the UK too, didn't it? Places like East Midlands and Yorkshire and beyond. What was said about it in Westminster?
Yes, well, was it the wrong sort of rain? The Environment Secretary, Therese Coffey, was asked about it in a committee, and she seemed to be saying that the Met Office is terribly good at predicting rain coming from the west, but actually not so good at rain coming from the east, because that's less common, and that had affected preparedness. I must say that in the Commons chamber, Labour weren't particularly sympathetic to that and said that the government simply hadn't done enough to help protect people from Storm Babette. The Minister, of course, didn't take that view at all and pushed back hard to say they had done a lot.
As the Secretary of State set out in the House last week, an emergency response centre was set up, and in advance of the storm, DEFRA and the Cabinet Office convened the National Flood Response Centre to coordinate the response, and cross-government meetings have been taking place daily since last Wednesday and will continue to do so this week.
Events like Storm Babette are not unexpected. We know floods happen every winter. The Minister stating in her statement that assets having not been designed for such rare extreme levels of rainfall shows complacency. We know climate change is bringing more frequent and more severe rainfall events. And as I know myself from the terrible floods in 2007, where 16,000 properties were flooded in Hull, flooding has a devastating impact on people's lives. their belongings lost, businesses destroyed. The country must be better prepared, and we need to be taking our climate goal changes seriously.
I would say far from being complacent. That's exactly, we are exactly the reverse of that. She suggested that we need to be better prepared. That's exactly what the whole of our flood budget is geared up to doing. That's why we doubled it to £5.2 billion. It was 2.6 billion pounds. It's now £5.2 billion with all of the associated flooding schemes that is delivering.
As many as 400 homes across Brampton, Birdholme, Riverside and Tapton Terrace have been flooded, as well as countless businesses that now face a fight for their survival. It's particularly hard to bear as the vast majority of these properties are the very same ones that were flooded in 2007, despite the government implementing schemes to protect the River Rother. I'd like to ask the Minister why residents on Tapton Terrace only received a phone call from the early warning system after their houses had already been flooded. What assessment has the Minister made of the success of the early warning system?
We were in touch over the weekend, weren't we, with you, feeding that straight in, and indeed the situation in Tapton Terrace, which I've fed into the Environment Agency. I know they're working very closely with people up there to fully review what happened. So that will be part of the review that we instigate.
We do also need to remind councils of their responsibilities to make sure they communicate information effectively to our constituents. As in my case, one of the emergency respite centres was closed with only 20 minutes notice, and one of the emergency phone lines was down for nearly 2 days. And can we also please ask councils to stop building on floodplains?
I thank him for that, and also I know that the Secretary of State visited his constituency just today and will have been able to see for herself exactly what local people are facing there.
That's the Minister taking questions on Storm Babette there, but MPs also heard from the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, this week, who announced that the government is going to be taking migrants out of 50 hotels by the end of January. And it's also come in the same week that they took some migrants back onto the barge that's moored off the coast of Dorset near Portland, Bibby Stockholm. What did MPs make of what the Minister had to say?
Well, as you can imagine, it was pretty popular with Conservative MPs who are very keen to see hotels in their constituencies hosting tourists again instead of asylum seekers. Labour opposition MPs, though, were pretty underwhelmed. They felt this was a bit of window dressing. 50 hotels wasn't very much out of the whole. Suggested that the government still wasn't really getting a grip on the backlogs, on where people would be accommodated other than hotels. And on the numbers coming over. Now, the government says it is getting the number of people crossing the Channel down, but it came down really to another argument about the weather, whether it's the weather in the Channel that was making the difference.
As a result of the progress we've made to stop the boats, I can inform the House that today the Home Office wrote to local authorities and MPs to inform them that we will now be exiting the first asylum hotels. Hotels in all 4 nations of the UK. The first 50 of these exits will begin in the coming days and will be complete by the end of January, with more tranches to follow shortly. But we will not stop there. We will continue to deliver on our strategy to stop the boats, and we will be able to exit more hotels.
For the 3rd year running, more than 25,000 people have crossed the Channel in small boats, while the number of hotels being used is around 400, at an eye-watering cost to the taxpayer of £8 million a day, higher than last year. And the government's response, a Rwanda plan, but they've sent more Home Secretaries to Rwanda than asylum seekers, an illegal migration act that's utterly counterproductive and hasn't even brought into full force yet, and a new barge that was meant to bring down hotel costs, but has just added to them. And the military bases promised by the Prime Minister last year, December, are still not ready. All of which has left the Prime Minister with an asylum strategy this summer that was less akin to the Australian asylum model that he's so desperate to replicate, and more in tune with the Australian cricket team during this summer's Ashes. Cross your fingers and pray for rain. Surely the Prime Minister knows that this was the wettest summer since 1912. Surely he recognises the impact that this had on small boat crossings.
It's all down to the weather again. Every time I come to this chamber, it's about the weather. The honourable gentleman is becoming the Michael Fish of British politics. He always gets the forecasts wrong. The truth is, he can't bear to admit that our plan is actually starting to work. Returns are up. Raids are up. Productivity is up 10 times. And above all, small boat arrivals are down. We are closing hotels. He wants to open our borders.
The Liberal Democrats submitted a Freedom of Information request to the Home Office to ask about the cost of the Bivvy Stockholm. We asked about the cost to taxpayers of buying the barge, as well as the estimated costs of running it over the next 12 months. Now, the cost is estimated at £20 million per year, well over £300,000 per week. But why has the Home Office refused to put this information into the public domain, and why have they declared that it would not be in the public interest?
The honourable gentleman is essentially a humanitarian NIMBY. He comes to this House to say that we should be a welcoming nation and invite more people here, but he doesn't want to face up to the consequences as to where those people should be housed.
I would like to assure members across the House that the sun often shines on our blessed corner of Kent, and indeed we had a heat wave on 1 or 2 occasions this year, so let's not have any more of this weather nonsense.
At the heart of this issue is fairness. And when a number of my constituents who are struggling to pay their energy bills, struggling to put food on the table, can see a 4-star hotel, and they're all men, going to their buffet every day and not paying a penny, it strikes at the heart of that fairness. And does the Minister agree with me also that those constituents of mine who used to work in the hotel, who were pressured to resign, should be not only offered their jobs back, but ideally on better terms than before? And that also connects to the fairness point.
Well, I feel very strongly that we're sent to this place to represent the interests of our constituents, and we shouldn't elevate the interests of illegal migrants over the communities that we're elected to serve. That is exactly what the approach that my honourable friend has taken, fighting tenaciously to get that hotel closed for asylum seekers and returned to the community uses that his constituents value.
That's Robert Jenrick there. Thank you very much, Susan, for talking us through all of that. We'll come back to you again shortly. Let's go over to Cardiff now, though, and our Wales political reporter, Cemlyn Davis, who's at the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd. Cemlyn, the First Minister faced questions this week about the NHS and ambulance service in Wales. What's the issue?
Yes, this was after the Welsh Ambulance Service declared what it's called an extraordinary incident across Wales on Sunday, but especially in the Swansea Bay University Health Board area. It took that decision because of significant delays that were happening at the time in transferring patients from ambulances and into hospital. Now, that incident, that situation had been de-escalated by Monday evening, but it was raised here during FMQs on Tuesday.
First Minister, on the weekend, the pressures that the ambulance service is facing here in Wales was amplified by 3 major events. And in fact, the ambulance service called for an extraordinary incident situation to be declared. In Morriston in Swansea, 16 ambulances were parked outside the A&E department and there was a wait of 28 hours. Just outside Llangollen, an elderly gentleman fell over and a neighbour had to perform paramedic duties on that elderly gentleman, and in the end the wife of the gentleman had to transfer him to hospital after a 4-hour wait. And regrettably, in Caerphilly, a lady waited 22 hours and sadly and tragically died in the back of an ambulance. We are at the start of the winter season. What confidence can you give us that the measures of the Welsh Government in conjunction with the Welsh Ambulance Service will make a real difference to ambulance response times here in Wales and ultimately get the flow through the hospital system so that there isn't that situation that we saw across Wales occurring week in, week out through the winter months?
I wish I could say to the member that there'll be no further extraordinary incidents over this winter. But I'm afraid that would be an over-optimistic statement. There were extraordinary incidents last winter in Wales, in England, in Scotland, and with the pressures that the service is under, despite the enormous efforts that staff make, we have to be realistic and say that when the huge pressures come on, declaring an extraordinary incident in order to mobilise extra help will be one of the techniques that those responsible for managing the service will have to have at their disposal.
Well, Mark Drakeford also told Mr Davis that the ambulance service and the NHS will look to learn lessons from previous years to make sure they're as prepared as possible for what's to come over the coming months. He also said that ambulance staffing levels are at their highest since devolution began, but Andrew Davis was unconvinced that the government had a plan to deal with the pressures coming up over the winter.
OK, I'm sure we'll keep across that story as we head into the winter. The Welsh Government also launched a plan this week to tackle absenteeism in school. What will that entail?
Yes, this has been a real problem in Wales since the pandemic, with recent figures showing 16.3% of 11 to 15-year-olds are persistently absent from school. That's 3 times the figure if we look back at before COVID struck. And if we then look at pupils who are eligible for free school meals, well, the rates go higher, up to 35.6%. And so this week, the Welsh Government has come up with a plan to try and get to grips with this issue.
It is a challenge which countries across the world are grappling with in a very serious-minded way as a consequence of some of the pressures caused by COVID. It's not entirely a consequence of that, but it is certainly a significant contributor. And the nature of absence seems to have become more complex and again more multifaceted and for a range of different and possibly new reasons. This is not the product of any one school system. It's a set of common challenges, but we are not stepping back from the challenge, very much the opposite.
Well, part of the government strategy now is to lower the threshold at which a pupil is classed as being persistently absent from missing 20% of half-day school sessions to missing 10%. That brings it in line with England. Now, that is likely to mean that thousands more pupils are going to be classed from now on as being persistently absent, but the government says that will allow schools and welfare services to intervene sooner. OK. And Senedd members also discussed the admission by Welsh Water that they'd been illegally spilling untreated sewage at dozens of treatment plants for years. What's going to be done? Yeah, that's right. And for example, in Cardigan in West Wales, untreated sewage has been spilled into the Teifi estuary for at least a decade, we now know. Now, Dŵr Cymru, Welsh Water, a not-for-profit company, says the issues have been caused by old and leaky pipes, and that work on a new plant in Cardigan, at least, will begin in 2025. But as you say, this was all discussed here on Wednesday.
I, and I'm sure others, were appalled by the revelation last week that Dŵr Cymru has been illegally dumping untreated sewage at dozens of treatment plants for years. This utter disregard for the rules meant to protect our precious natural environments and our health is unacceptable.
I absolutely agree with you that this is not good enough and we need to do something about it. But like all of these things, there are a lot of politics behind this. The way that water investment has been treated over the last, 14 or 15 years is to say that the water companies can only invest if they put the price of that onto the bills of their customers. That's not the way we invest in other infrastructure. We don't invest in roads in that way, for example.
Yes, the Climate Change Minister, Labour's Julie James, there suggesting that the UK Conservative government is at least partly to blame for this. Well, the Welsh Conservatives here rejected that suggestion and urged the Minister to make sure that Welsh Water are held to account. The company says it's trying to put things right.
It's a hot topic, sewage, isn't it? Cemlyn Davies in Cardiff Bay, thank you so much for the update. Let's go back to Westminster now and to our parliamentary correspondent, Susan Hume. Susan, the cost of living has really been a kind of prominent theme in politics throughout most of this year, really, hasn't it? Including the rising cost of rents. And this week, MPs were debating the government's renters reform bill. What's the purpose of that?
Well, this is the government's promise to renters in private accommodation to get rid of what's known as Section 21 no-fault evictions. There's been a big increase in these. It's where landlords can get tenants out pretty quickly, sometimes offering the property back to them, but on a higher rent. Now, there's been a bit of a backlash, though, from Conservatives, some of whom are also landlords, because they say, well, if you get rid of these quickie evictions, then you have to go through the courts. And the courts, particularly since the pandemic, have been pretty gummed up. Certainly nothing quick there. And landlords have to be able, in some way, to be able to get their properties back. So the Housing Secretary, Michael Gove, offered a compromise, and that was they won't action this bill, won't actually get rid of the no-fault evictions until the courts are working all nicely and smoothly and quickly. Well, Labour say, when is that going to actually happen? So in fact, this is really just you going back on your promise.
Given the number of people in the private rented sector, it is absolutely vital that we ensure that tenants have the rights that they deserve, but also given the importance of the private rented sector to our economy and the fact that the overwhelming number of private landlords provide an excellent service, it is also important that we provide them with the rights and redress required when dealing with antisocial tenants, tenants in arrears, or other factors that may mean that they need to have recourse to securing vacant possession of that property.
Private rents are the key cause of core inflation, and this is a disastrous bill for every renter in the country who wants to see a well-supplied housing market.
I'm very, very fond of my honourable friend, but that's just not true. I mean, the case is that we've actually seen an increase in the number of homes in the private rented sector recently. We haven't seen a reduction. And I have to say, well, as we say in Scotland, facts are chills that win a dig. But let me say to him, and indeed to the whole House, that what we need is not so much an arbitrage between the private rented sector and the number of homes available for private ownership, or indeed the social rented sector. What we need is more homes overall. Section 21, no-fault eviction, is used by that small minority of bad landlords essentially to intimidate tenants. It is in nobody's interest to allow unscrupulous landlords to continue to behave in this way, to allow vulnerable people to be rendered voiceless in this way, and to force the taxpayer to pick up the bill. The idea that abolishing Section 21 is somehow unconservative is to me absolutely nonsensical.
After 4.5 years of foot dragging, there could be no more different delay in ending no-fault evictions. The Secretary of State made some strong points in his opening remarks, but I'm afraid he didn't see the faces on his side. And I can see why the Secretary of State has spent years arguing with the landlords on his backbenchers. Tenants across the country have been wrongfully evicted, kicked out of their homes.
Right, Susan, just before we go, things are looking a little bit different next week, aren't they? Because Parliament's about to be prorogued ahead of the King's speech. Can you just explain what that means?
Well, who doesn't enjoy a bit of dressing up, Charlotte? I know I do. So, indeed, this session of Parliament finished yesterday. It's been going for 18 months. 18 months ago, when Queen Elizabeth was still on the throne, Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. But all of the bills that were announced then have mostly become law. So it's time to end this session. So there were some scarlet robes, there was some doffing of highwayman hats and a bit of Norman French, of course, a bit of ceremony there. Much more of that kind of thing, as you say, in about 10 days' time when it's the state opening. We'll have the King himself, we'll have the horses, we'll have the trumpets and the fanfares. What's not to like?
Oh, lots of pomp and ceremony to look forward to. Thank you so much, Susan. Right, that's all we've got time for on Politics UK this week. Politics Live will be back on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and iPlayer. In the meantime, have a great weekend.